This video is about solving quadratic equations by factoring. So first, a little bit about terminology. This is a quadratic because we see that the highest exponent is 2. It's an equation because there's an equal sign, left side and right side. So what we're doing is we want to find all possible values of x that would make this equation true. Now, we can't use basic algebra to solve a quadratic equation because there's no way to get x by itself just by doing addition and subtraction like you're used to in equation solving. So this is going to take a different technique. Now, I've already written a step-by-step process on the side. The first thing to note is that the right-hand side must say equals 0. So if there's anything other than 0 on the right-hand side, you want to move that to the left. And then step 2, I circled this in red because it is the most important step, and that's to factor the left-hand side, which is nice because we already know how to factor. Now, if you stumbled across this video and you don't know how to factor, I have some videos on factoring quadratics. That's the key skill. I'll get to step 3 and step 4 as we move through this problem. So, step number 1, the right-hand side must say equals 0. Well, that's already done. This equation already says equals 0. Step 2 is to factor the left-hand side. So, we're going to factor. Now, I actually skipped over something that you should always think about. You want to look at the terms and see if there's a common factor. Well, there's not. There's no number that will go into 9, 36, and 32. The next example, we'll see what to do when that happens. So, with some trial and error and some mental math, we factor the left-hand side. So 3x times 3x is very possibly how this factors because 3x times 3x is 9x squared. I know that I'm going to have 2 plus signs. The reason I know that is the 2 constants are going to have to multiply to give positive 32, but we also need positive x's, so it definitely can't be minus and minus. All right, so let's see. 8 times 4. 8 times 4 is 32. But remember from a prior video, you do have to test the outside and the inside. 3x times 4, that's 12x. 8 times 3x, that's 24x. 24x and 12x, that is 36x. So we know that we factored this correctly. So now, let's go on to step 3 and think about why this is true. What we have here is we have a factor multiplied by another factor that equals 0. Well, 0 is a very special number when you're multiplying. The only way you can multiply 2 factors together and get 0 is if the first factor equals 0 or if the second factor equals 0. That's the only way you can multiply to get 0. So that's why we have step 3. And then step 4, well, notice we have these 2 linear equations. So solve both of those. So let's see. We'll subtract 8. We'll subtract 4. We'll divide by 3. And we'll divide by 3. So you'll notice, and this is usually the case, although we'll talk about this in detail quite a lot, this quadratic equation has 2 solutions, and that's very common. So, that's the basic technique. The right-hand side must say equals 0. You factor the left-hand side, you set each factor equal to 0, and then you solve. Alright, so let's do another example. I'm going to clear the entire screen. I'm going to take away the step-by-step process. You may want to write that down if you're doing a bunch of practice problems. So, let's consider this example. So step 1 is that the right-hand side must say equals 0. So all I'm going to do is some basic algebra. I want to move these 3 terms to the left. So I'm going to add a positive 3m squared to move this term from the right to the left. So I have an m squared plus 3m squared is going to be 4m squared. And then there are no linear terms. There is no m to the first power term. So when I move this over, I'm going to subtract 10m. That's all we have. And then I'm going to move this 3 over, so I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. I already have a negative 3. I'm subtracting another 3, so I have minus 6 equals 0. Okay, so that's step 1. This must say equals 0. Step 2, you factor the left-hand side. Now, the first step in any factoring problem is to look for a common factor. Now, what you're used to doing when you're factoring quadratic expressions is you notice, well, there's a common factor of 2. So normally what you would do is you factor out that 2, and you'd have 2m squared minus 5m minus 3, and then we'd have equals 0 on the end. Now, we can simplify our lives just a little bit. Because this is an equation and not an expression, there's a left-hand side and a right-hand side. So instead of factoring out this 2 and just letting it hang out in the front, I can divide both sides of this equation by 2. So if I just divide by 2 on both sides, what happens is, well, 0 divided by 2 is still 0. So basically, you don't have to keep this common factor out front since you can divide by it. Just saves you a little bit of writing. Okay, so we're still in step 2. We need to factor the left-hand side. And I forget what the answer is, so I'm not 100% sure how this factors, but we'll figure it out. 2m times m, that's the only way to get 2m squared. Now, the constants have to multiply to get negative 3, so I'm going to have 1 plus and 1 minus. I'm not sure which is which. So with some trial and error and some mental math, I think this is going to be minus 3 and plus 1. So 1 times negative 3, that is negative 3. When you test the outside and the inside, 2m times negative 3, that's negative 6m. 1 times m is m, so negative 6m plus m, that is the negative 5m that you want. So we factored the left-hand side. Step 3 says set each factor equal to 0. And now solve these two equations. And guys, this is just a 2-step equation. Feel free to solve this in 1 step. Subtract 1 and then divide by 2. So again, we have 2 solutions. And that's the basic idea. If you already know how to factor, then solving quadratics by factoring, you pretty much already know how to do it. It's not any more difficult than just factoring, because factoring is the hardest step. Now, I am going to show you one more example, because this one is very often messed up, so it's useful to keep in mind. Now, the right side already says equals 0, so we move on to step 2, which says factor. And the first step in any factoring problem is to remove a common factor. So the common factor here is 5k. Now, unlike in the last problem, I'm not going to divide by that. You are allowed to divide by numbers. I could, if I wanted to, divide by 5 on both sides. That's part of my GCF. Remember, the GCF is 5k. But you're not allowed to divide by variables. Now, there's lots of reasons why. I just take my word for it for the moment. So I can't divide by 5k on both sides because that includes a variable. So I'm not going to divide by 5k. I'm just going to factor that out like we're used to. And that's going to be 5k plus, I guess, 7. So we have factored the left-hand side. I have 2 linear factors, and that's the whole idea of factoring quadratics. So let's just move on to step 3. Set each factor equal to 0. 5k equals 0, or 5k plus 7 equals 0. And solve these 2 equations. Divide by 5 on both sides. You have k equals 0. And like I said, please feel free to solve these equations in 1 step. And you're done. So you have 2 solutions, 0 and negative 7/5. The reason I did this as a 3rd example is this type of quadratic where the only step in factoring is removing the GCF. For some reason, a lot of students will jump the gun and they'll immediately jump in and try to factor like you're used to, and well, you're not going to make it very far. So don't forget, the first step in a factoring problem is to take care of the common factors. Anyway, that is how you solve quadratic equations by factoring. Now I have some bad news. Not all quadratics will factor. So to solve quadratic equations where you can't factor, that's going to prove to be kind of difficult. And that's what we're doing next. Anyway, hope this video helped.